Solve this and I'll give you $100 million. The Arab billionaire's voice dripped with mockery as he towered over the 12-year-old girl in her mother's maid uniform. The world's greatest engineers had failed. His empire was crumbling. And now in front of millions watching live, a child dared to claim she knew what was destroying the tallest building on Earth. The room erupted in laughter, but within hours, that laughter would turn to stunned silence. Friends, if you're watching from Dubai, New York, or anywhere around the globe, drop your city in the comments below. Let me show you how far this incredible story has traveled. The Oasis Tower pierced the Dubai skyline like a silver needle threading through heaven itself. 163 floors of curved glass and steel that caught the desert sun and threw it back in rainbow fragments across the city. Adrian Khalil stood on the observation deck, his Italian leather shoes planted firmly on marble that cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. Below him, the city sprawled in organized chaos, a testament to human ambition built on sand and oil and dreams. "Sir, the Japanese delegation has arrived." His assistant Marcus announced, his British accent crisp despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Even with the building's state-of-the-art climate control, the observation deck felt oppressive today. Adrian didn't turn. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who had conquered industries, bent governments to his will, and turned sand into gold. 53 years old, with silver threading through his black hair, like premature victory banners, he had the bearing of a man who had never heard the word no and meant it. "Tell them to wait," Adrian said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I want them to feel it first." "Feel what, sir?" As if in answer, a low vibration rolled through the building. It started in the bones first, a thrumming that made teeth ache and stomachs turn. The windows, each panel worth a small fortune, began to sing a discordant note that grew louder with each passing second. Marcus grabbed the railing as the sound peaked, a groaning wail that seemed to come from the building's very soul. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. "That," Adrian said quietly, "is what's going to destroy everything I've built." 3 floors below, in the maintenance staff's changing room, Elena Carter carefully folded her cleaning uniform and placed it in her locker. Her hands, weathered from years of honest work, moved with practiced efficiency. She was 41, though the worry lines around her green eyes made her look older. Her auburn hair, pulled back in a severe bun, had started showing gray at the temples, each strand a marker of struggles survived. "Mama, it happened again," a young voice said from the doorway. Elena turned to see her daughter Lila, all of 12 years old, but with eyes that held an unusual depth. The girl was small for her age, with her mother's auburn hair, but falling in wild curls that refused any attempt at taming. She wore a hand-me-down school uniform that had been washed so many times the navy blue had faded to something closer to gray. "I know, baby," Elena said, pulling her daughter into a quick hug. "Were you scared?" Lila shook her head, but her eyes told a different story. "The other kids at school say the building is cursed. They say it's going to fall down." "Buildings don't fall down from curses," Elena said firmly, though her own heart harbored doubts. "Mr. Khalil has the best engineers in the world working on it." "But they've been working on it for 3 months, Lila said, pulling out a small notebook from her backpack. The pages were filled with sketches and numbers diagrams that looked far too complex for a 12-year-old. "And it's getting worse." Elena glanced at the notebook, a habit she'd developed since Lila had started carrying it everywhere. Her daughter had always been different, special, in ways that both filled Elena with pride and terror. In a world that crushed the unusual, being special was dangerous. "We need to go," Elena said, closing the locker. "I have the executive floors today, and you have homework." "Can I come with you?" Lila asked. "I promise I'll be quiet. I'll just sit in the corner and read." Elena hesitated. Bringing Lila to work was technically against regulations, but the girl's regular babysitter had canceled, and Elena couldn't afford to miss a shift. Not with rent due next week. "Fine," she said. "But you stay invisible. Understand Mr. Khalil is having important meetings today." They took the service elevator, a steel box that smelled of industrial cleaner and broken dreams. As they rose through the building's spine, Elena watched the floor numbers climb. Each level represented a different world. The shopping floors where she could never afford to shop. The restaurant floors where a single meal cost more than she made in a week. Office floors where decisions were made that affected millions of lives, but never seemed to improve hers. The executive floor was a temple to wealth. The corridor stretched endlessly, lined with actual gold leaf that caught the light from crystal chandeliers. Original paintings, Picasso's, Monet's, a Basquiat that Adrian had bought at auction for $47 million decorated the walls like casual afterthoughts. Elena began her work methodically, starting with the conference rooms. She moved like a ghost, trained by years of service to be present, but never seen. Lila found a corner in the main conference room, settling behind a massive potted palm that provided perfect cover. She opened her notebook and began sketching, her eyes occasionally lifting to study the room's architecture. The building hummed again. This time it was different. The sound seemed to rise from the foundation itself, traveling up through steel and concrete like blood through veins. The crystal chandelier above the conference table began to sway, its 10,000 pieces singing against each other in a symphony of impending disaster. Elena grabbed the edge of a table, her knuckles white. Lila didn't move from her corner, but her pencil flew across the page, capturing something in the pattern of the vibration that everyone else was too panicked to notice. The door burst open, and Adrian Khalil stormed in, followed by a parade of executives and engineers. His face was thunder, his dark eyes scanning the room with the intensity of a predator seeking prey. "Is it getting worse?" he barked at a thin man in a lab coat, Dr. Harrison, the lead structural engineer from MIT, who'd been brought in at an astronomical fee. "The frequency has increased by 12% since last week." Dr. Harrison said, his voice shaking almost as much as his hands. "The harmonics they're impossible, Mr. Khalil. According to every model, every calculation, this shouldn't be happening." "I don't pay you for impossibilities," Adrian snarled. "I pay you for solutions." A woman in a severe black suit, Sarah Chen, the chief financial officer, cleared her throat. "Adrian, we need to discuss evacuation procedures. The insurance companies are getting nervous. If someone gets hurt, no one is evacuating anything." Adrian cut her off. "This building is my legacy. It's the tallest structure ever built by human hands. It will not fall on my watch." "But sir," another engineer spoke up, a younger man with nervous eyes, "the resonance is causing microfractures in the glass panels. We've already had to replace 17 on the north face. At this rate what?" Adrian turned on him. "Tell me with all your degrees and expertise what exactly is causing this." Silence fell like a stone into deep water. "That's what I thought," Adrian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "None of you know. The best minds in the world, and you're all useless." From her corner, Lila watched and listened. Her notebook was now filled with observations, the way the sound changed when the wind shifted, how the building's decorative fins caught the air, the mathematical patterns hidden in what everyone else saw as chaos. Elena, meanwhile, had become truly invisible, frozen in place with her cleaning cloth in hand. She'd learned long ago that when powerful men raged, The safest place was in plain sight, but beneath notice. "We've consulted with teams from Tokyo, New York, London," Dr. Harrison said, attempting to salvage some dignity. "The Japanese team believes it might be related to underground water flow." "The water table is 300 feet down," Adrian interrupted. "Try again." "The British engineers suggested wind load. We tested for winds up to 200 miles per hour. The building barely swayed." "Then perhaps you're all incompetent," Adrian finished. "Get out, all of you. I need to think." The room emptied like water from a broken dam, executives and engineers fleeing Adrian's wrath. Only Elena remained still, frozen, still invisible, and Lila hidden behind her palm tree, sketching furiously. Adrian walked to the window, his reflection multiplied in the layered glass. Outside, Dubai stretched endlessly, a city built on ambition and oil dreams and sand. His city in many ways. He'd built a third of its skyline, each building a stepping stone to this moment, this pinnacle. The Oasis Tower was supposed to be his masterpiece. The building that would stand for 1,000 years, a testament to human achievement that would outlast empires. Instead, it was dying sick with a disease no one could diagnose. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a Saudi prince who'd invested $2 billion in the project. "Your Highness," Adrian answered, his voice automatically shifting to the smooth tone of a man who'd spent decades courting money. "Khalil." The prince's voice was cold. "I'm watching CNN. They're calling your tower the humming death trap. Do you understand what this means for my reputation? It's a temporary setback. Temporary." The prince's laugh was bitter. "My wives are afraid to shop in the boutiques. My children's tutors refuse to enter the building. Fix this, Khalil, or I'll have my lawyers dissect your contracts until they find a way to take everything." The line went dead. Adrian stood in the silence, his empire balanced on the edge of a knife. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. The building hummed again, softer this time, almost like it was laughing at him. Elena finally moved, resuming her cleaning as if she'd never stopped. She worked her way around the room, careful to stay out of Adrian's line of sight. She was almost at the door when Lila sneezed. Adrian spun around, his eyes scanning the room like searchlights. They found Lila immediately, a small girl with a notebook, trying to disappear behind a palm tree. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you doing here?" Elena rushed forward, placing herself between Adrian and her daughter. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Khalil. She's my daughter. The babysitter canceled and You brought a child into my private conference room." Adrian's voice was ice. "Do you have any idea what sensitive information is discussed here?" "She wasn't listening," Elena said quickly. "She was just drawing. She likes to draw buildings." Adrian's eyes narrowed, focusing on the notebook in Lila's hands. "Show me." Lila looked at her mother, who nodded slightly. With trembling hands, she held out the notebook. Adrian took it, flipping through the pages with increasing interest. The sketches were remarkable, not just artistic, but technical. The girl had captured details of the building's structure that most architects would miss. And on the most recent pages, she'd drawn something else: sound waves, wind patterns, mathematical equations that looked almost like music. "You did this?" he asked Lila directly. She nodded, finding her voice. "I like to understand how things work. And what do you think is wrong with my building?" Elena stepped forward. "Mr. Khalil, she's just a child." "Quiet," Adrian said, not taking his eyes off Lila. "I asked her a question." Lila swallowed hard, then spoke in a clear, small voice. "It's singing. Singing. The building. It's like when you blow across a bottle and it makes a sound, but bigger." Adrian stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed a harsh, bitter sound. A child thinks my building is a giant whistle. That's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. He tossed the notebook back to Lila. Your mother is fired. Security will escort you both out. If I see either of you in this building again, I'll have you arrested. Please, Mr. Khalil, Elena begged. I need this job. We have nowhere else. You should have thought of that before you violated security protocols, Adrian said, already turning away. Marcus, get security up here now. As they waited for security, Lila clutched her notebook to her chest. She wanted to tell him more to explain what she'd observed, but the words wouldn't come. She'd seen something in the patterns, something everyone else was missing, but who would listen to a 12-year-old girl? The security guards arrived, 2 men in black suits with faces like stone. They flanked Elena and Lila, ready to escort them out. Wait, Adrian said suddenly. He'd walked back to the window, and the building was humming again. This time, cracks appeared in the glass spiderweb fractures that spread like frozen lightning. Everyone out! Now! The evacuation was chaos. Alarms blared as thousands of people fled the building. Elena and Lila were swept along in the tide of humanity, pushed and pulled through stairwells and corridors. By the time they reached the ground floor, news vans were already arriving. They stood on the sidewalk looking up at the Oasis Tower. Even from here, they could hear it, that deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the building's bones. Mama, Lila said quietly. I know what's wrong with it. Elena looked down at her daughter, this strange, brilliant child who saw the world in patterns and equations. I know you do, baby, but no one's going to listen to us. As they walked away, neither of them saw Adrian watching from a window high above. He'd noticed something in the girl's drawings, something that nagged at him like a splinter in his mind. The way she'd drawn the wind patterns around the building's decorative fins. The mathematical notations that looked almost like frequency calculations. He pulled out his phone and called Marcus. Find out everything you can about that cleaning woman and her daughter. Everything. Sir, you just fired them. I know what I did. Just do it. Adrian hung up and stared at the notebook he'd secretly photographed while pretending to flip through it. The girl had seen something all his experts had missed. The building hummed again, and another window cracked. Time was running out. That night, Elena and Lila sat in their small apartment in Deira, far from the glittering towers of downtown Dubai. The place was clean, but worn with furniture bought secondhand and walls that needed painting. It was a far cry from the luxury Elena cleaned every day, but it was home. I'm sorry, Mama, Lila said, curled up on the couch with her notebook. I got you fired. Elena sat beside her, pulling her close. No, baby. It's not your fault. Mr. Khalil is just... He's under a lot of pressure. But I could help him, Lila insisted. I know I could. Grandpa taught me about resonance, about how buildings can sing. He saw it in the war when bombs would hit, and some buildings would fall while others just hummed. Elena's father, Walter, had been a military engineer in Vietnam. He'd spent his last years filling Lila's head with stories and equations, passing on knowledge that seemed to live in the girl's DNA. He'd died 2 years ago, but his influence lived on in every sketch Lila drew. Sometimes knowing isn't enough, Elena said softly. Sometimes the world doesn't want to hear what we have to say. Lila opened her notebook to a fresh page and began drawing again. This time she drew the Oasis Tower as it could be the same beautiful structure, but with tiny modifications to the decorative fins. She added calculations in the margins, frequencies, and angles that would break up the resonance. Grandpa always said that the biggest problems have the simplest solutions, she said. People just make them complicated because they can't believe something simple would work. Elena watched her daughter work, this tiny genius trapped in a world that would never see past her age or their circumstances. It broke her heart. The phone rang, startling them both. Elena didn't recognize the number. "Hello? Mrs. Carter?" The voice was crisp, professional. "My name is Marcus Williams. I'm Mr. Khalil's personal assistant. He would like to meet with you and your daughter tomorrow morning." Elena's heart stopped. "Are we in trouble?" "On the contrary. Mr. Khalil has reconsidered his earlier decision. He would like to offer you your job back with a promotion. And he'd like to speak with your daughter about her observations." Elena looked at Lila, who had stopped drawing to listen. "What time?" Elena asked. "A car will pick you up at 7. And Mrs. Carter, tell your daughter to bring her notebook." The line went dead. Lila and Elena looked at each other, hope and fear warring in their eyes. "He wants to see my drawings," Lila whispered. "He wants something," Elena corrected. Men like Adrian Khalil always want something. But despite her caution, Elena felt a flutter of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to listen to what her daughter had to say. The next morning came too quickly and not fast enough. Elena dressed in her best clothes, a simple blue dress she'd worn to Walter's funeral. Lila wore her school uniform, the cleanest one, with her wild hair pulled back in a ponytail that was already coming loose. The car that picked them up was worth more than Elena would make in 5 lifetimes. Black, sleek, with leather seats that felt like clouds. The driver said nothing, just navigated through Dubai's morning traffic with practiced ease. They arrived at the Oasis Tower to find it surrounded by even more news vans. Reporters thrust microphones at the car, shouting questions that were muffled by the bulletproof glass. "Is the building being evacuated? Has anyone been hurt? Is Adrian Khalil bankrupt?" The driver pulled into an underground garage away from the chaos. Marcus was waiting for them, and his usual composure slightly frayed. "Thank you for coming," he said, leading them to a private elevator. "Mr. Khalil is in the Crisis Management Center. He's been there all night." The Crisis Management Center was on the 40th floor, high enough to be away from the press, but low enough to evacuate quickly if needed. It was a room Elena had never cleaned, filled with screens and computers, engineers and executives, all talking at once. Adrian stood at the center of it all, his clothes rumpled, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night. When he saw them, he dismissed everyone else with a wave of his hand. "Leave us." The room emptied until only Adrian, Elena, Lila, and Marcus remained. Adrian walked over to Lila, his intimidating height, forcing her to crane her neck to look at him. "Show me," he said simply. Lila opened her notebook, her hands steady despite her racing heart. She flipped to the pages she'd drawn last night. "The building's decorative fins." She began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about something she understood. "They're arranged in a pattern that creates what Grandpa called a Helmholtz resonator when the wind hits them at certain angles." "A what?" Adrian asked. "It's like, imagine the building as a giant flute. The fins are the holes, and the wind is someone blowing across it. But because the fins are all the same size and evenly spaced, they create a single note. And that note matches the building's natural frequency." She flipped to another page showing her calculations. "Every building wants to move at a certain speed, like how a swing wants to go back and forth at its own rhythm. When the wind song matches that rhythm, they amplify each other. That's why it's getting worse. The building is teaching itself to sing louder." Adrian studied the drawings, his expression unreadable. "And your solution? Change the song," Lila said simply. "Add small baffles to the fins, each one slightly different. Random sizes, random angles. It'll break up the resonance. The wind will still blow, the building will still stand, but they won't sing together anymore. That's it. Adrian's voice was skeptical. My engineers have run thousands of simulations, spent millions on consultants, and you're telling me the solution is some random pieces of metal? Not random, Lila corrected. Calculated randomness. Each baffle designed to disrupt specific frequencies. It's like adding people who can't sing to a choir. They break up the harmony. Adrian turned to Marcus. Get Dr. Harrison back here. Now. Within minutes, the lead engineer arrived looking harried and exhausted. Run a simulation, Adrian ordered, showing him Lila's drawings. Exactly as she's drawn it. Dr. Harrison looked skeptical but began inputting the data. The room filled with the sound of keyboards clicking, computers humming. On the main screen, a 3D model of the Oasis Tower appeared. Running wind simulation now, Dr. Harrison announced. They watched as virtual wind flowed around the building. Without the modifications, the resonance pattern appeared immediately, red zones indicating dangerous vibration levels. Now adding the proposed baffles, Dr. Harrison said, his skepticism evident. The model updated. The wind still flowed, but now it broke apart, scattered into 1,000 harmless eddies. The red zones disappeared, replaced by calm blue. The room was silent. Dr. Harrison ran the simulation again and again. Each time the result was the same. This is, he stammered. This is impossible. A child couldn't, but she did, Adrian said quietly. He turned to Lila. How did you know? I listened, Lila said. Everyone else was trying to stop the sound, but I listened to what the building was trying to say. Adrian walked to the window, looking out at his empire. The morning sun caught the glass, turning the building into a pillar of fire. How long to implement? He asked Dr. Harrison. If we work around the clock, 2 weeks, maybe less. Do it. Dr. Harrison hesitated. Sir, shouldn't we run more tests, consult with the other teams? Adrian turned, and for the first time since they'd arrived, he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, but it was genuine. No, we're going with the girl's solution. But sir, that's an order. As Dr. Harrison scrambled to organize work crews, Adrian walked back to Lila. You've saved my building, he said. Name your price. Elena stepped forward. Mr. Khalil, we don't want... I wasn't talking to you, Adrian said, his eyes never leaving Lila. She solved the problem. She names the price. Lila thought for a moment. I want to go to university. To study engineering like Grandpa. Done. Full scholarship to any school in the world. And I want Mama to have her job back. She'll be promoted to head of housekeeping. Triple the salary. Lila nodded, then added quietly, and I want you to listen. Adrian frowned. Listen to what? To everyone. The cleaners, the security guards, the people who work in your buildings every day. They see things, know things, but you never listen to them. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, not the bitter laugh from before, but something almost genuine. You drive a hard bargain, little engineer. Over the next 2 weeks, the Oasis Tower became a hive of activity. Work crews installed Lila's baffles, each one precisely calculated and positioned. The press speculated wildly about what was happening, but Adrian said nothing. Lila came every day after school, watching the work, making small adjustments. The workers, initially skeptical about taking orders from a child, quickly learned that she knew exactly what she was talking about. Elena, meanwhile, found herself in a strange new position. As head of housekeeping, she had an office, a team, respect. It felt surreal. On the 14th day, the work was complete. The entire city seemed to hold its breath as the wind rose that evening. It came from the desert, hot and strong, the the kind of wind that had triggered the worst of the resonance. The building stood silent. No hum, no vibration. Just the quiet whisper of wind through the modified fins, a sound like the desert itself breathing. The press went wild. Adrian held a press conference standing beside the model of the building, explaining the solution in terms that made it sound like his engineering team had solved it. He never mentioned Lila. But that night, a package arrived at Elena and Lila's apartment. Inside was a contract for Lila's education, a new employment contract for Elena, and a handwritten note. The building sings a different song now. Thank you for teaching me to listen. AK. There was also a check, not for 100 million, that would come later in a moment of public drama that would change everything. But for now, it was enough to move them to a better apartment, to buy Lila proper supplies for her drawings, to breathe, without worrying about next month's rent. That night, Lila stood on their new balcony, looking at the Oasis Tower glowing in the distance. It stood tall and silent, no longer crying out in pain. Grandpa would be proud, Elena said, joining her. He always said that engineering was just listening to what the world wants to be, Lila replied. The building wanted to stand. It just didn't know how to stop singing. As they watched, the lights of the Oasis Tower flickered in a pattern that looked almost like Morse code. Lila smiled. She knew it was just a coincidence, a trick of the electrical system, but she liked to think it was the building's way of saying thank you. The real test would come tomorrow. Adrian had called another meeting, this time with all his investors, including the Saudi prince. He wanted Lila there, though he hadn't said why. Are you nervous? Elena asked. No, Lila said, and meant it. I know what the building needs, and now so does he. But neither of them could have predicted what Adrian was planning. The billionaire who had built his empire on crushing the weak was about to do something unprecedented. He was going to admit he was wrong, and he was going to do it in front of the whole world. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legend, a moment when a 12-year-old girl would stand before some of the most powerful men in the world and prove that wisdom doesn't always come with age, wealth, or degrees. The Oasis Tower stood ready to witness history, and this time it would remain silent, letting others do the talking. The morning sun painted shadows across Dubai's skyline as Elena and Lila prepared for what would become the most important day of their lives. Neither knew that in just a few hours, Adrian Khalil would throw down a gauntlet that would capture the world's attention, a $100 million bet that would transform a maid's daughter into a global sensation. But for now, they simply dressed carefully, Lila tucking her notebook under her arm like armor, Elena smoothing her daughter's wild hair one more time. Remember, Elena said softly, no matter what happens, you've already won. You saved the building. Lila nodded, but her eyes were distant already, thinking about frequencies and wind patterns, about the mathematics of sound and the poetry of engineering. The car was already waiting. Their destiny was calling, and it sounded nothing like a hum. The private elevator rose through the Oasis Tower's spine with a silence that felt wrong after weeks of that terrible humming. Lila pressed her hand against the glass wall, feeling for vibrations that were no longer there. The building was quiet now, almost peaceful, but the real storm was waiting 40 floors up. Stay close to me, Elena whispered, though her daughter showed no signs of the nervousness that was making Elena's stomach churn. The invitation had come at dawn, delivered by Marcus himself rather than a phone call, which meant whatever Adrian Khalil had planned was significant enough to require absolute certainty they would attend. The elevator opened directly into the crown jewel of the Oasis Tower, the Summit Conference Room, a space that had hosted presidents and princes where deals worth billions were signed with fountain pens that cost more than most people's cars. Today, it was packed with faces Elena recognized from business magazines and news broadcasts. The Saudi prince sat at the far end of the table, his traditional white thobe immaculate, his expression carved from stone. Around him clustered other investors, each radiating the kind of power that came from having enough money to buy small countries. Adrian stood at the head of the table, and Elena was struck by the change in him. The man who had raged and threatened just 2 weeks ago now moved with a different energy, still dangerous, but controlled like a sword being deliberately sheathed rather than wildly swung. "Gentlemen," Adrian began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "and ladies," he added, nodding to the 3 women among the investors, "I've asked you here to witness something unprecedented." The Saudi prince shifted in his chair, his dark eyes skeptical. "We've already seen the repairs, Khalil. The building no longer sings its death song. My architects have reviewed the modifications. Simple baffles, they tell me. Embarrassingly simple." "Embarrassingly simple," Adrian repeated, savoring the words. "Yes, Your Highness. So simple that none of our experts thought of it. Not the team from MIT. Not the consultants from Tokyo or London. Not the artificial intelligence programs we ran through millions of simulations." He gestured to Lila, who stood beside her mother near the wall, trying to remain invisible despite being the focus of everyone's attention. This child saw what they all missed. A ripple of disbelief ran through the room. Several investors actually laughed. "You're telling us," said a German man with steel-gray hair. Heinrich Zimmermann. Elena recognized him as the head of a massive construction conglomerate, that a little girl solved a problem that stumped the world's best engineers. "I'm telling you exactly that," Adrian said. He pulled up a hologram display, the building's latest technology, projecting 3-dimensional images into the air above the conference table. "But don't take my word for it. Dr. Harrison," the lead engineer, stepped forward, his discomfort obvious. He'd aged years in this past months, and being forced to admit his failure to a room full of billionaires wasn't helping. "The solution," Dr. Harrison began, his voice tight, "involved recognizing that our decorative fin array was creating what's known as a Helmholtz resonance when struck by wind at specific angles and velocities. The uniform spacing and sizing of the fins, designed for aesthetic perfection, accidentally created the world's largest wind instrument." "We know this," the prince interrupted. "You've explained the problem. The question is how a child saw what you didn't." Dr. Harrison's face reddened. She listened differently. We were all trying to eliminate the sound. She tried to understand it." Adrian walked over to Lila, towering over her small frame. "Tell them what you told me," he said, "about your grandfather." Lila looked up at the room full of powerful strangers, and Elena saw her daughter's hands tighten on her notebook. But when she spoke, her voice was clear. "My grandfather was an engineer in Vietnam," she said. "He used to tell me about how bombs would hit buildings and some would fall while others would sing. He said structures want to survive, they just need help finding their balance. When I heard the Oasis Tower humming, I recognized it. It wasn't crying. It was trying to find its voice." "Poetry," Zimmermann scoffed. "We're talking about engineering, not metaphors." "Engineering is poetry," Lila replied, and something in her tone made the room go quiet. "Every equation tells a story. Every structure has a rhythm. You just have to know how to read it." She opened her notebook, holding it up so they could see her sketches. "I mapped the wind patterns for 6 weeks. I sat in different parts of the building and felt how the vibrations changed. I didn't need millions of dollars of equipment. I just needed to pay attention." The Saudi prince leaned forward, his interest finally piqued. And the solution? Calculated chaos, Lila said. Instead of perfect uniformity, we introduced controlled randomness. Each baffle is different, breaking up the resonance patterns. It's like... She paused, searching for an analogy they'd understand. It's like a crowd of people walking across a bridge. If they all walk in step, the bridge shakes and could collapse. But if everyone walks at their own pace, the bridge stays stable. Adrian smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd just spotted prey. Brilliant, isn't it? So brilliant that I'm willing to make a wager. The room tensed. Adrian Khalil's wagers were legendary, brutal demonstrations of his confidence that had crushed competitors and made him even wealthier. What kind of wager? The prince asked carefully. Adrian walked to the window, looking out at his city, his back to the room, a power move that said he didn't need to watch their faces to know he had them. There's another building, he said. In Singapore, France, the Lotus Spiral. You all know it. Everyone did. The Lotus Spiral was the Oasis Tower's only real competitor for the title of world's tallest building, depending on how you measured. It had been completed 6 months ago and was already showing signs of structural stress that had its investors panicking. Similar problem, Adrian continued. Different cause. Their engineers are stuck just like ours were. I propose we send the girl to solve it. You can't be serious, Zimmerman said. Adrian turned and his smile was sharp enough to cut glass. $100 million serious. If she can't solve the Lotus Spiral's problem within 1 week, I'll pay each of you $100 million. If she succeeds, you each pay her that amount. The room erupted. Everyone talking at once, voices raised in disbelief, anger, opportunity. $100 million was pocket change to anyone at this table, but the principle, the sheer audacity of the bet, was staggering. Elena stepped forward, her protective instincts overwhelming her trained invisibility. Mr. Khalil, you can't gamble with my daughter like she's... Like she's what? Adrian asked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Like she's a genius who deserves to be recognized. Like she's someone whose talents should be rewarded, rather than ignored, because of her age and circumstances. He addressed the room. You all have children. Privileged children who go to the best schools, have the best tutors, every advantage money can buy. And yet none of them saw what this maid's daughter saw. Doesn't that tell you something about what we're missing, about who we're overlooking? The Saudi prince stood slowly, his presence commanding attention. This is absurd, Khalil. Even if we agreed the Lotus Spiral's owners would never... They already have. Adrian interrupted, pulling out his phone and displaying an email. Desperate times, Your Highness. They're 3 weeks from default. They'll try anything. The girl is 12 years old. A woman investor protested, Madeleine Rousseau, a French pharmaceutical heiress. Mozart was composing at 5, Adrian countered. Pascal invented the calculator at 19. Age is just a number when genius is involved. He looked directly at Lila. Of course, the choice is hers. I won't force anyone into this wager. All eyes turned to the small girl clutching her notebook. Elena started to speak to protect her daughter from this insanity, but Lila raised her hand slightly, a gesture so reminiscent of her grandfather that it made Elena's heart ache. I'll need to see the building first, Lila said, to listen to it. You're actually considering this? Zimmerman asked, incredulous. Lila met his gaze steadily. You don't believe I can do it. That's fine. Most people don't believe children can do anything important. But Mr. Khalil is right about one thing: we see things you don't, because you're not looking for us to see them. She turned to Adrian. But I have conditions. Adrian's eyebrows rose. Conditions? If I solve it, the money goes into a trust for my education and my mother's retirement. And you announced to the world that a 12-year-old maid's daughter solved both buildings' problems. No hiding it. No pretending it was your engineers. Lila, Elena whispered urgently. And, Lila continued, you create a program for children like me. Poor children, children of workers, children who are brilliant but invisible. You give them the chance to learn to contribute. The room was silent. Even Adrian looked taken aback. You're negotiating with me? He asked. You said I could name my price once, Lila replied. I'm naming it now. The Saudi prince laughed a rich, genuine sound that surprised everyone. I like this child, Khalil. She has more spine than half the men in this room. All right, Adrian said slowly. If you succeed, all your conditions will be met. If you fail... If I fail, we go back to our old life and you all get richer, Lila said. It seems like you can't lose either way. The girl makes a point, Madeleine Rousseau admitted. What's 100 million against the entertainment value alone? One by one, the investors agreed. Documents were drawn up on the spot. Adrian had come prepared. Elena realized. This had all been planned, orchestrated like a performance. As lawyers hustled to prepare contracts, the Saudi prince approached Lila. Up close, he was less intimidating with laugh lines around his eyes and fingers stained with ink from his fountain pen. You remind me of my youngest daughter, he said quietly. She sees patterns in everything, too. Drives her tutors mad with questions they can't answer. Maybe she should be teaching them, Lila suggested. The prince smiled. Maybe she should. He leaned closer, conspiratorial. The lotus spiral has a twist in its structure. Literally. The architects thought it would be artistic. I thought it was foolish. Perhaps that will help you. Before Lila could respond, Marcus appeared with a tablet for signatures. The contracts were extensive, but the core was simple: 1 week, 1 building, 1 girl against problems that had defeated the world's best. As Elena signed as her daughter's guardian, her hand shook. You don't have to do this, she whispered to Lila. Yes, I do, Lila replied. Not for the money, not even for the recognition, but because there are other kids like me out there, and someone needs to prove we matter. Adrian overheard and smiled that predator's smile again. Careful, little engineer. You're starting to sound like someone who could run a company someday. Maybe I will, Lila said. Maybe I'll run yours. The room laughed, but Adrian didn't. He studied the girl with new interest, seeing perhaps for the first time not just a useful tool, but a potential rival. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises to reconvene in 1 week. As the investors filed out, each paused to look at Lila, some with skepticism, others with curiosity, a few with something approaching respect. Heinrich Zimmermann was the last to leave. He stopped at the door, turning back. For what it's worth, he said to Lila, my engineers have been studying the lotus spiral for months. They say it's impossible to fix without rebuilding the entire structure. Your engineers also thought the Oasis Tower couldn't be fixed, Lila pointed out. True, he admitted. But this is different. The lotus spiral isn't just humming, it's dying. After he left, Adrian, Elena, Lila, and Marcus stood alone in the massive conference room. The holographic display still showed the Oasis Tower, now silent and stable. A private jet will take you to Singapore tonight, Adrian said. Marcus will accompany you to handle logistics. You'll have access to any equipment, any experts you need. I don't need experts, Lila said. I need silence. Time to listen. Whatever you need, Adrian agreed. Then, almost as an afterthought, why did you agree to this? Really? Lila looked out the window at Dubai, spreading below a city built on impossible dreams. My grandfather used to say that every generation has someone who sees what others miss. Usually they're ignored because they don't fit what people expect genius to look like. He died thinking no one would ever hear what I could hear, see what I could see. She turned to Adrian. You're giving me a chance to prove him wrong. That's worth any risk. That afternoon, as they prepared for the trip to Singapore, Elena found herself in the surreal position of packing for her daughter to save a building worth billions. Lila sat at their small kitchen table surrounded by notebooks, tablets loaded with architectural plans, and photographs of the lotus spiral from every angle. It does twist, she murmured, tracing the building's distinctive spiral shape with her finger. One complete rotation from base to top. They thought it would distribute wind load better. Did it? Elena asked, folding clothes she'd hastily bought with the credit card Marcus had provided. No, it created a vortex, like water going down a drain, but in reverse. Lila pulled out her calculator running numbers with the speed of someone who thought in mathematics. The twist accelerates the wind as it rises. By the time it reaches the top, she trailed off, lost in calculations. Elena watched her daughter work this child, who had somehow become the hope of billionaires and the subject of a wager that would make headlines around the world. A knock at the door interrupted them. Elena opened it to find Marcus looking unusually casual in jeans and a polo shirt. The car will be here in an hour, he said. Mr. Khalil wanted me to give you this. He handed Lila a leather-bound journal, clearly old and well-used. Inside the front cover was an inscription in Arabic with an English translation below. For my son Adrian, may you learn to listen before you speak. Ibrahim Khalil. It was his father's, Marcus explained. He was an engineer too before he became a businessman. Mr. Khalil thought you might appreciate it. Lila ran her fingers over the pages filled with hand-drawn diagrams and equations, notes in multiple languages, the work of a mind that saw the world in patterns and possibilities. Thank you, she said softly. Marcus hesitated, then added, For what it's worth, I think you can do this. I've worked for Mr. Khalil for 10 years, and I've never seen him bet on anything he wasn't certain of. He's not betting on me, Lila corrected. He's betting against everyone else's blindness. The ride to the airport was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Dubai passed by outside the windows, transitioning from the gleaming downtown to the industrial districts where the real work of the city happened. Lila watched it all, seeing the patterns in traffic flow the rhythms of construction, the dance of cranes against the sky. At the private terminal, a gleaming jet waited its stairs down like an invitation to another world. The pilot greeted them personally, assuring them of a smooth flight to Singapore. As they settled into seats that were more like small beds, Elena finally voiced what had been bothering her all day. Why do you think he's really doing this? Adrian Khalil doesn't do anything without an angle. Lila looked up from the journal she'd been studying. He's rebranding. The Oasis Tower nearly destroyed his reputation. If I succeed, he becomes the visionary who recognized genius where others saw nothing. If I fail, he's just a man who believed in a child's potential. Either way, he wins. You've thought this through. I think everything through, Lila said. It's how I knew I could solve the Oasis Tower. And it's how I know the lotus spiral is different. Different how? Lila turned to the window as Dubai fell away below them, the Oasis Tower standing tall and silent among its peers. The Oasis Tower was singing because it wanted to live. The lotus spiral, I think it's screaming because it's dying, and I might not be able to save it. Elena reached over, taking her daughter's hand. Then why agree to try? Because everyone deserves someone who'll listen to their last words, Lila said. Even buildings. The jet climbed into the darkening sky, carrying them toward Singapore, toward a spiral of glass and steel that was slowly tearing itself apart toward a challenge that would either make Lila a legend or prove that even genius has its limits. Behind them, the Oasis Tower caught the last light of day, its modified fins breaking the wind into harmless whispers. It had been saved by a child who listened. Now that same child was flying toward another giant in distress, armed with nothing but notebooks and the ability to hear what others missed. In the leather-bound journal, Ibrahim Khalil had written something in the margins of one page, a note his son Adrian had probably never noticed. The greatest structures are not built by those who impose their will on materials, but by those who understand what the materials want to become. Lila traced the words with her finger as the plane flew through the night. Somewhere ahead, the Lotus Spiral was waiting, screaming its structural anguish into the Singapore sky. And she would be there to listen, to understand, and perhaps, just perhaps, to heal. The flight stretched through the night, with Elena sleeping fitfully, while Lila filled page after page with calculations. Marcus worked quietly on his laptop, occasionally glancing at the child, who held several fortunes in her small hands. As they descended toward Singapore, the city appeared like a circuit board of light against the dark sea. And there, twisting up from the heart of the financial district, was the Lotus Spiral, illuminated by spotlights that couldn't quite hide the scaffolding that had been erected at various levels, desperate attempts to shore up what was failing. "My God," Elena breathed, seeing it for the first time. "It's massive." It was more than massive. It was impossible, a building that corkscrewed around itself, each floor rotated exactly 3 degrees from the one below, creating a full 360-degree twist from base to crown. In daylight, it was said to be beautiful. In the darkness lit from below, it looked like a giant's DNA strand, reaching toward heaven. The architects won 17 awards for the design, Marcus said. They called it the future of sustainable architecture. The twist was supposed to reduce wind resistance and capture rainwater more efficiently. Instead, it created a death spiral, Lila said quietly. She pressed her face to the window, studying the building's illuminated skeleton. "Look at the scaffolding pattern. They're trying to brace it at the stress points, but they're actually making it worse. The additional weight is changing the load distribution." Marcus started to ask how she could possibly know that from just looking, then stopped himself. He'd learned over the past weeks that questioning Lila's observations was pointless. She saw what she saw, and she was invariably right. They landed at Changi Airport just after midnight. A convoy of black cars waited to take them to the Lotus Spiral, where an emergency meeting had been arranged with the building's owners and engineers. The ride through Singapore's empty streets felt like approaching a funeral. The Lotus Spiral grew larger, with each block its twisted form becoming more disturbing the closer they got. Even from the ground, Lila could see the subtle lean to the structure, maybe 2 degrees off vertical, invisible to most, but screaming danger to anyone who understood engineering. They were met in the lobby by a group of exhausted-looking people in wrinkled suits and hard hats. The lead engineer, a Japanese man named Yamamoto, looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "You're the child?" he asked in accented English, his tone hovering between hope and disbelief. "I'm the engineer," Lila corrected. "Age is irrelevant to physics." Yamamoto studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. What do you need?" "Access to every floor, silence, and someone to turn off all the building's active stabilization systems." "Turn them off." Yamamoto looked alarmed. "Those systems are the only thing keeping the building from showing you what's really wrong," Lila interrupted. "You can't diagnose a patient while you're medicating the symptoms." Yamamoto looked at Marcus, who shrugged. She saved the Oasis Tower. Mr. Khalil trusts her judgment. Mr. Khalil isn't here if the building collapses, Yamamoto pointed out. It won't collapse, Lila said with a confidence that seemed absurd coming from someone her age. Not tonight. It's dying slowly. You have maybe 3 months before catastrophic failure, unless there's a typhoon. Then you have about 6 hours. How could you possibly know that? Lila walked to the lobby's center, where a scale model of the building stood in a glass case. She ran her finger along its spiral edge. The twist creates a helical vortex when wind hits it, like a drill bit made of air. Every rotation amplifies the force. In normal conditions, it's manageable. But a typhoon would turn this building into a 300-meter-tall auger trying to drill itself into the ground. She looked up at Yamamoto. When's typhoon season? It starts next month, he admitted. Then we have time, but I need those systems off. Now. It took an hour of arguments and phone calls to people in different time zones, but eventually Yamamoto gave the order. One by one, the building's stabilization systems powered down. The lotus spiral began to move. It was subtle at first, just a gentle sway that could have been imagination. Then the creaking started a sound, like a ship at sea would, straining against waves, except this was steel and concrete fighting wind that shouldn't have been strong enough to cause such movement. Everyone out, except essential personnel, Yamamoto ordered. The lobby emptied quickly, leaving only Yamamoto, his assistant, Marcus, Elena, and Lila. Now we listen, Lila said. She started on the ground floor, walking slowly, her notebook out, making marks that looked like musical notation. Every few steps she would stop, place her hand on a wall or pillar, and close her eyes. Elena watched her daughter work this strange ritual that looked more like meditation than engineering. They took the service elevator. The main elevators had been shut down for safety. As they rose through the building, the movement became more pronounced. By the 20th floor, Elena had to hold the rail to keep steady. The twist accelerates everything, Lila explained to Yamamoto, who was recording everything on his tablet. Not just wind, but the building's own movement. Each floor wants to sway at its natural frequency, but the twist forces them to move together in a pattern they don't want to follow. So we need to let each floor move independently? Yamamoto asked. No, that would tear the building apart. Lila stopped at a window, watching the lights of Singapore blur slightly with the building's movement. We need to give the energy somewhere else to go. They continued upward. 40th floor, 60th, 80th. The higher they went, the more violent the movement became. By the time they reached the 100th floor, furniture was sliding across rooms, and the sound was no longer creaking, but screaming metal under stress concrete beginning to crack. We should go back down, Yamamoto said, his face pale. Not yet, Lila said. She was scribbling frantically now, equations flowing across the page like water. I need to reach the top. The top floor was an observation deck meant to be the crown jewel of Singapore's skyline. Now it was a nightmare of motion, the windows showing a city that swooped and tilted like a drunk person's vision. Elena dropped to her knees, overwhelmed by vertigo. But Lila stood in the center, arms slightly spread for balance, feeling the building's pain through her feet. She stood there for 5 full minutes, swaying with the structure, becoming part of its rhythm. I know what's wrong, she finally said. They made their way back down the descent, feeling even worse than the climb. By the time they reached the lobby, Elena was shaking, and even Marcus looked green. Lila immediately began drawing on a large whiteboard someone had brought. The design that emerged was elegant in its simplicity, a series of massive pendulums hidden within the building's core, each one tuned to a different frequency. Tuned mass dampers, Yamamoto said, recognizing the concept. But the building already has one. One isn't enough for a spiral structure, Lila explained. The twist creates multiple resonance points. You need 17 dampers each positioned at a node where the rotational force peaks. She showed him the calculations. The placement had to be precise off, by even a meter, and the dampers would make things worse. But positioned correctly, they would absorb the destructive energy, letting the building move safely. The cost, Yamamoto started, is less than the lawsuits when the building falls, Marcus said bluntly. Mr. Khalil's investors are prepared to fund the modifications if it means saving their rival's building. The publicity alone is worth it. Yamamoto studied the plans, had his assistants run simulations on their computers. Everything checked out. The theory was sound. But dampers this size, they'll take months to build and install. 6 weeks, Lila corrected. If you work around the clock. The typhoon season gives you a deadline. Meet it or evacuate. She pulled out a second set of drawings. And while you're installing the dampers, you need to add these. The second design was even simpler, vertical fins running up the building's exterior, following the spiral, but breaking it into segments. They'll interrupt the helical vortex, she explained, like speed bumps for wind. The building will still twist, but the wind won't be able to use it as an amplifier. Yamamoto looked at the 12-year-old girl who had just potentially saved a $5 billion building and hundreds of lives. How do you see these things? Lila thought for a moment. You look at buildings like they're supposed to stand still, but nothing stands still. Everything moves, vibrates lives. Buildings are just very slow dancers. The trick is teaching them the right steps. The next morning, as Singapore woke to the news that a child had solved the Lotus Spiral crisis, Adrian Khalil held his own press conference in Dubai. He stood in front of the Oasis Tower, its silent strength a backdrop to his words. 2 weeks ago, this building was dying, he said to the assembled media. The world's greatest engineering minds couldn't save it. But a 12-year-old girl could. Why? Because she listened instead of assuming. Because she understood that complexity often masks simple truths. He held up a photograph of Lila. Her name is Lila Carter. Her mother is a maid. Her grandfather was a war engineer who died in obscurity. She has no advanced degrees, no sophisticated equipment, no corporate backing. What she has is the ability to see what we've trained ourselves to ignore. The media exploded with questions, but Adrian raised his hand for silence. I've made a wager with my fellow investors. If Ms. Carter successfully saves the Lotus Spiral, which she has, each of us owes her $100 million. But more than that, we owe her recognition, and we owe every child like her the chance to be heard. He announced the formation of the Walter Carter Foundation, named for Lila's grandfather, dedicated to finding and nurturing genius in unexpected places. The initial endowment would be $500 million. Back in Singapore, Lila watched the press conference on Marcus's laptop. She sat in the Lotus Spiral's lobby, surrounded by engineers, now eager to hear her every word, treated like the genius she'd always been, but never been acknowledged as. He's using you, Elena said quietly, watching Adrian's performance. I know, Lila replied, but I'm using him too. Every child who gets a chance through that foundation is a victory. The work began immediately. Crews worked 24 hours a day installing the dampers according to Lila's precise specifications. She supervised personally, catching 3 potentially catastrophic errors in the first week alone. But it wasn't just about the engineering. As word spread of the young girl saving buildings that experts couldn't, something shifted in the public consciousness. Parents began listening to their children's observations. Teachers started paying attention to the quiet students in the back. Companies began recruiting from community colleges, not just Ivy League schools. Lila became a symbol, but she remained focused on the work. Every day she climbed the lotus spiral, feeling its movement, adjusting the damper positions, by centimeters fine-tuning the building's new dance. 5 weeks into the installation, with only 1 week left before the investors reconvened, disaster nearly struck. A calculation error, not Lila's, but from one of the senior engineers who'd corrected her work, led to a damper being installed at the wrong angle. The building's sway immediately worsened. "We need to remove it and start over," Yamamoto said, panic in his voice. "But that'll take weeks." Lila studied the mistake, then did something unexpected. She smiled. "No," she said. "We use it. Install another damper here." She pointed to a spot 3 floors up, at exactly this angle. "They'll work against each other in normal conditions, but together during high winds." "That makes no sense," one of the engineers protested. "Music makes no sense if you analyze each note separately," Lila replied. "But together they create harmony, same principle." They followed her instructions, skeptical but desperate. When the second damper was installed, the building's sway decreased dramatically. The mistake had become part of the solution. On the final day, as the last damper was being tested, a storm hit Singapore, not a typhoon, but strong enough to test the modifications. The city held its breath as winds exceeding 60 miles per hour battered the lotus spiral. The building stood firm. It swayed, yes, but gracefully like a dancer, bending with the music rather than fighting it. The helical vortex that had been its weakness was broken up by the new fins turned into harmless eddies that dissipated against the glass. Inside, Lila stood on the observation deck with Elena Marcus Yamamoto and a gathering crowd of engineers, investors, and media who'd been allowed up for this historic moment. The view swayed gently, but no more than any other tall building in a storm. "It's working," Yamamoto said, tears in his eyes. "It's actually working." Adrian Khalil's voice came through on a video call broadcast on screens around the deck. Behind him stood the investors from that fateful meeting, including the Saudi prince. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adrian said, "I believe we have a winner." One by one, the investors confirmed their transfers. $100 million from each deposited into a trust for Lila Carter. The total, $1.2 billion. The room erupted in cheers, but Lila wasn't celebrating. She was at the window watching the storm, listening to the building's new song, not a scream of pain, but a hum of contentment, of structure and nature finding balance. "What are you thinking?" Elena asked, joining her daughter. "That Grandpa was right," Lila said. "Every problem has a solution. We just have to be brave enough to listen for it." As the storm passed and Singapore emerged into sunlight, the lotus spiral stood transformed. No longer a dying giant, but a testament to the power of unconventional thinking, of listening to those we usually ignore, of recognizing that genius doesn't always come in expected packages. The media called it the miracle of the spiral, but Lila knew better. There was no miracle, just physics and patience, observation and understanding. The real miracle was that someone had finally given her the chance to show what she could do. That night, in their hotel suite, that cost more per night than their old apartment cost per year, Elena found Lila on the balcony sketching again. "What are you drawing now?" Elena asked. "The next building that'll need help," Lila said. "There's a bridge in San Francisco that's starting to sing. They don't know it yet, but they will in about 6 months." "You're 12 years old," Elena reminded her. "You should be thinking about school friends, normal things." Lila looked up at her mother. "I've never been normal, Mama. Grandpa knew it. You know it. And now the world knows it. The question is, what do I do with it?" Elena pulled her daughter close. Whatever you want, baby. For the first time in our lives, we can do whatever you want. But even as they celebrated, neither of them knew that Adrian Khalil was already planning his next move. The billionaire who'd built an empire on seeing opportunities others missed had recognized something in Lila that went beyond engineering genius. She didn't just solve problems. She saw them coming. And in a world built on unstable foundations, financial, environmental, social, someone who could see the cracks before they became chasms was worth more than any building. The game was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. The return journey to Dubai felt different. The same private jet, the same leather seats, but everything had changed. Lila stared out the window at the clouds below her reflection, showing a 12-year-old girl who had just become one of the wealthiest children in history. Yet wealth wasn't what occupied her mind. It was the weight of what came next. Marcus sat across from them, fielding calls from media outlets around the world. CNN wanted an exclusive. The BBC had offered a documentary. 3 publishers were bidding for book rights to a story that was still being written. "Tell them all no," Lila said quietly, not turning from the window. Marcus paused mid-conversation. "No, Lila, these opportunities will still be there tomorrow," she finished. "But right now I need to think." Elena watched her daughter with growing concern. Since the moment the money had been confirmed, Lila had withdrawn into herself, that brilliant mind turning inward like a telescope reversed. "What's wrong, baby?" Elena asked, moving to sit beside her. "The prince knew," Lila said suddenly. "The Saudi prince. He knew the Lotus Spiral had a twist problem. He gave me a hint back in Dubai." "So he helped you?" "No, Mama. Don't you see? He knew, which means his engineers knew. They could have fixed it themselves, maybe not as elegantly, but they could have done something. So why didn't they?" Marcus lowered his phone, suddenly paying attention. "What are you suggesting?" Lila turned from the window, her young face serious. "I'm suggesting that saving buildings wasn't the point of the wager. I was being tested for something else." The plane descended through Dubai's afternoon heat, the city shimmering like a mirage made real. The Oasis Tower stood tall among its piers, no longer singing its distress, but silent and strong. As they drove through the city, Lila noticed things she'd missed before: construction sites abandoned mid-build engineering firms with 4 lease signs, the subtle signs of an industry in crisis. Adrian was waiting for them in his office, not the conference room this time, but his personal space at the very top of the Oasis Tower. It was smaller than Lila had expected, almost intimate, with walls lined with engineering books and models of buildings he'd built around the world. "Congratulations," he said, but his tone suggested this was just the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. "You've become quite famous, the girl who listens to buildings." "Buildings are easy," Lila replied, taking a seat without being invited. Elena started to correct her manners, but Adrian waved her off. "They follow physics. They can't lie. People are harder." Adrian smiled, the expression genuine for once. "And what do you hear when you listen to people?" "Fear," Lila said simply. "Everyone's afraid. The engineers are afraid of being wrong. The investors are afraid of losing money. You're afraid of being forgotten." Adrian's smile faded slightly. "And you? What are you afraid of?" "That I was right about the test. That this was never about the buildings." Adrian stood walking to a wall where architectural drawings covered every surface. But these weren't his buildings. They were projects from around the world, each marked with red X's. 17 major structures have failed in the last 5 years, he said. Not collapsed necessarily, but failed in their purpose. Towers that can't be occupied. Bridges that sing in the wind. stadiums that amplify sound until they're uninhabitable. Every one was designed by the best firms, built by the best contractors, approved by the best engineers. He turned to face her. Do you know what they all had in common? Lila studied the drawings, her mind already seeing patterns. They were all revolutionary designs, each one pushing boundaries, trying to be the first, the biggest, the most impressive. Exactly. We've entered an age where our ambition exceeds our understanding. We can build anything we can imagine, but we've forgotten to ask if we should. Adrian moved to his desk, pulling out a thick folder. This is why you were really tested. The folder contained plans for something called the Phoenix Project, a city. Not just any city, but a floating city designed to house climate refugees built on revolutionary technology that would allow it to ride out hurricanes and rising seas. 10 nations have committed to funding it, Adrian explained. It will be humanity's first truly international city belonging to no country but serving all. The engineering challenges are unprecedented. And you want me to review the plans, Lila said. I want you to lead the safety assessment team. Elena stood abruptly. She's 12 years old. You can't seriously expect. I expect her to do what she's been doing, Adrian interrupted. Listen, observe, see what others miss. She wouldn't be alone. A full team of engineers would support her, but her voice would have final say on whether something is safe to build. Lila was already absorbed in the plans, her fingers tracing the revolutionary foundation system that would allow the city to flex with waves rather than fight them. The basic concept is sound, she murmured. But these junction points, they're assuming calm seas. What happens in a Category 5 hurricane? That's exactly the kind of question we need asked, Adrian said. Before we build, not after. Why me? Lila asked, looking up from the plans. Really why? Not the story you'll tell the media, but the truth. Adrian was quiet for a moment, then pulled out a photograph from his desk drawer. It showed a younger version of himself standing next to an older man, who looked remarkably similar, his father, Ibrahim. My father was a genius, he said quietly. He could see structural solutions in his sleep. But he was also a Syrian refugee who spoke broken English and had no formal education. No one would listen to him. He died knowing he could have prevented 3 major building failures if anyone had just listened. He put the photograph away. I built my empire on his knowledge, his insights. But I built it by hiding where it came from, by pretending the ideas were mine or came from my hired experts. I've been a thief my entire life, stealing credit from those who deserve it. The confession hung in the air like dust in sunlight. Marcus looked shocked. He'd clearly never heard this before. Elena's expression softened slightly. So, this is what redemption, Lila asked. This is recognition that the next generation of problems requires the next generation of minds, Adrian replied. And that genius doesn't wear a suit or carry a diploma. Sometimes it wears a school uniform and carries a notebook. Lila stood walking to the window. Below Dubai sprawled in all its impossible glory, a city built on sand and ambition. If I do this, I have conditions. Of course you do, Adrian said, but he was smiling. First, the Walter Carter Foundation isn't just about finding gifted children. It's about listening to them, really listening. They get seats at the table, not just scholarships. Agreed. Second, my mother isn't just promoted. She becomes your chief operations officer for all humanitarian projects. She's been invisible in these buildings for years, seeing how they actually work, how people actually use them. That knowledge is valuable. Elena started to protest, but Adrian cut her off. Done. What else? The Phoenix project gets built in stages. A prototype first small scale tested in real conditions. We don't risk thousands of lives on untested theory. That will delay the project by years. Better delayed than destroyed, Lila countered. Adrian nodded slowly. Anything else? Lila turned from the window, and for a moment she looked far older than 12. You tell the truth about your father, publicly. Give him credit for the innovations that built your empire. Adrian's face went pale. That would destroy my reputation. No, Lila said firmly. It would transform it. You'd go from being a genius to being someone who recognized genius, from being a builder to being someone who builds up others. Which legacy do you think lasts longer? The room was silent, except for the subtle whisper of air conditioning. Marcus had stopped even pretending to work, watching this confrontation between a billionaire and a child who somehow held all the cards. Finally, Adrian laughed a real laugh full of genuine mirth. You know what the ironic part is? My father would have loved you. He always said the best engineers were the ones who weren't afraid to speak truth to power. He extended his hand. We have a deal, Ms. Carter. Lila shook it, her small hand disappearing in his large one. When do we start? There's a preliminary design meeting tomorrow. The lead architects will present their vision. I want you there listening. As they prepared to leave, Adrian called out, Lila, the money, the 1.2 billion. What will you do with it? She paused at the door. Build schools. Not fancy ones with marble floors and golden nameplates. Simple ones in places where children work instead of learn. Each one will have a workshop where kids can build, experiment, fail safely. Because that's how you really learn, by touching the world and feeling how it pushes back. That evening in their hotel suite, they hadn't yet decided where to live now that they could afford anywhere. Elena and Lila sat on the balcony, watching the sun set over Dubai. The city lights were beginning to twinkle, on each one representing lives they'd never intersected with before, but might now influence. Are you sure about this? Elena asked. It's a huge responsibility. Grandpa used to say that talent comes with responsibility, Lila replied. If you can see problems others can't, you have an obligation to point them out. You're still just a child. You should have time to be young, make mistakes, be silly. Lila smiled, a rare expression that made her look her age. I'll make mistakes, Mama. Probably big ones. But they'll be my mistakes, not someone else's, that I could have prevented. Elena pulled her close and they sat in comfortable silence. Then Lila asked, Are you ready to be a COO? Elena laughed, but it was tinged with nervousness. I don't know the first thing about being an executive. You know about people, Lila said. You know about systems that work and ones that don't. You've been studying this city's buildings from the ground up for years. That's more valuable than any MBA. The next morning came too quickly. The preliminary design meeting was held in a conference center attached to the Oasis Tower, a room filled with the world's most celebrated architects and engineers. They looked at Lila with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed resentment. Here was a child who'd been given authority over their work, their reputations, their legacies. The lead architect, a French woman named Claudette Moreau, who'd designed half of Paris's modern skyline, presented first. Her vision was breathtaking, soaring towers connected by sky bridges, gardens that climbed the buildings like green waterfalls, public spaces that seemed to float on air. It's beautiful, Lila said when the presentation ended. But beauty isn't enough when lives are at stake. What concerns do you have? Claudette asked, her tone professional but cold. Lila stood walking to the projected image of the city. These sky bridges, in a hurricane they become sails. They'll either tear away or pull the buildings together. She pointed to another section. These gardens are gorgeous, but the root systems will seek water. In a floating city, that means they'll eventually penetrate the flotation chambers. One by one, she identified potential failures not to destroy, but to improve. Some architects bristled, but others leaned forward intrigued by perspectives they hadn't considered. "What would you suggest?" asked an elderly Japanese architect named Yamada, who'd been watching with particular interest. "Start with the foundation," Lila said. "Not the physical foundation, the philosophical one. What is this city for? Is it to be beautiful, to be revolutionary, or to save lives?" "All three," Claudette said defensively. "Then prioritize them," Lila replied. "Lives first always. Revolution second. We need new solutions for new problems. Beauty last but not least. Because people need beauty to thrive, not just survive." She pulled out her notebook, sketching rapidly. "What if instead of fighting the ocean, we learned from it? Make the buildings like kelp, flexible, anchored at the base but free to move with the currents. Connect them with systems that stretch rather than rigid bridges. Create gardens in protected inner courtyards, not on exposed surfaces." The sketch that emerged was different from Claudette's vision, but somehow more elegant. It looked like a city that had grown from the ocean rather than been imposed upon it. "This is preliminary," Lila added. "We'd need to test models, run simulations, build prototypes. But the ocean has been designing things that survive hurricanes for millions of years. Maybe we should pay attention." Yamada was the first to speak. "In Japan, we have a saying, 'The bamboo that bends survives the storm, while the oak breaks.' This child understands what we forgot in our ambition." Not everyone was convinced. Several architects argued that Lila's approach was too conservative, that it lacked vision. The meeting grew heated, voices raised, egos bruised. Adrian watched it all from the back of the room, saying nothing. But when the shouting reached its peak, he stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "I want to tell you about my father." The room quieted, confused by the apparent non sequitur. Ibrahim Khalil was a refugee from Syria. He had no formal education, no credentials, no standing. But he could look at a building and see its soul. He tried to warn about the Metropolis Tower collapse in 1987. No one listened. He was just a refugee working construction. 43 people died. Adrian's voice remained steady, but his hands shook slightly. He tried again, with the Aurora Bridge resonance in 1993. Again, no one listened. The bridge had to be rebuilt at 10 times the cost of prevention. He died believing his insights meant nothing because they came from the wrong mouth. He looked directly at the architects who'd been arguing against Lila. "Every innovation in my buildings, the cantilevered design that made me famous, the wind flow systems that cut energy use by half the foundation technique that allows building on sand. They were all his ideas. I stole them, claimed them, built an empire on them." The confession landed like a zombom. Several people pulled out phones, undoubtedly alerting their news desks. Adrian's empire, built on borrowed genius, suddenly looked fragile. "But I'm done stealing," Adrian continued. "This child, this 12-year-old girl, has shown us what we've become, builders of monuments to our own egos rather than shelters for humanity. If you can't accept insights from a child, then you're not architects. You're just narcissists with drafting tables." He walked to Lila, placing a hand on her shoulder. "She has full authority on this project. Anyone who can't accept that is free to leave." 3 architects walked out immediately. 2 more followed after hesitation, but the rest stayed, including Claudette and Yamada. "Show us," Claudette said to Lila, her antagonism replaced by curiosity. "Show us how to build like kelp." What followed was 6 hours of the most intensive design session any of them had experienced. Lila's youth became irrelevant. as she dove deep into biomimicry, explaining how sea creatures survived in conditions that destroyed human structures. The architects, freed from their egos, began building on her ideas, adding their expertise to her insights. By the end of the day, they had the framework for something revolutionary, not just a floating city, but a living system that worked with the ocean rather than against it. Marcus had been live-streaming parts of the session with Adrian's approval. Within hours, it had gone viral. The hashtag #ListenToHer began trending, with parents sharing stories of innovations their children had suggested. Companies started creating junior advisory positions. Universities began accepting students based on demonstrated insight rather than just test scores. But not everyone was celebrating. That evening, Elena received a call from their old building supervisor, warning her that reporters had been asking questions about their past, looking for dirt on the girl who'd humbled the engineering establishment. "They're trying to find something to discredit you," he warned. "Be careful." Elena found Lila on the hotel balcony sketching again, this time what looked like underwater turbines. "For the city," Lila explained without looking up. "The ocean's movement could power everything if we harness it right." "Lila, we need to talk about what's coming," Elena said. "Fame isn't just opportunity, it's scrutiny. People will try to tear you down." "I know," Lila said calmly. "They're already saying I'm a fraud, that Adrian fed me the solutions. Some think I'm autistic and that's why I see patterns. Others think I'm not really 12, that it's all a publicity stunt. Doesn't that bother you?" Lila finally looked up. Grandpa faced worse. He had brilliant ideas, and no one listened because of who he was. I have the same ideas, and everyone listens because of what I've done. The work matters, not the opinions. But the next morning brought a challenge that had nothing to do with public opinion. Yamamoto from Singapore called with bad news. One of the Lotus Spiral's dampers had failed. Not the design, but the installation. A contractor had cut corners, used substandard materials. The building was swaying again. "Can you come?" Yamamoto pleaded. "The investors are panicking. They're talking about demolition." Lila looked at Adrian, who nodded. "The jet's ready when you are." But as they prepared to leave, Lila said something that chilled everyone. "This isn't an accident. Someone wanted that damper to fail." "That's a serious accusation," Adrian said. "It's a pattern," Lila replied. "The Oasis Towers problem appeared just as you were finalizing the biggest deal of your career. The Lotus Spiral's issues started right after it won the architecture awards. And now, just as we're designing a city that could change everything, another crisis appears." She pulled out her tablet, showing a map with red dots. "These are all the structural failures in the last 5 years. Look at the timing. Each one happened at a moment of maximum impact financially, politically, or socially." Adrian studied the pattern, his expression darkening. "You're suggesting sabotage." "I'm suggesting that someone benefits from these failures. Insurance companies pay out, but then premiums go up everywhere. Construction companies get massive contracts for repairs. Engineering firms get hired for emergency consultations at 10 times their normal rates." She looked at him steadily. "Who profits from fear, Mr. Khalil?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone, making a call to someone he only identified as an old friend in interesting places. "I need you to look into something," he said. "Structural failures, global pattern, last 5 years. Yes, I'm serious. Yes, it involves the girl." He hung up and turned to Lila. "If you're right, you've just made some very powerful enemies." "If I'm right," Lila countered, "then every building in the world is at risk, including your Phoenix City." The flight to Singapore took on a different tone. This wasn't just about fixing a building anymore. It was about uncovering something darker, a conspiracy that turned engineering into a weapon and buildings into victims. As they flew through the night, Lila worked on calculations while Elena slept fitfully, and Marcus coordinated with security teams. Adrian stared out the window, perhaps seeing his empire in a new light, not just as constructions of steel and glass, but as potential targets. "You know," he said to Lila, "when I made that bet, I thought I was testing you. But you've been testing us all along, haven't you?" Lila didn't look up from her work. "The world's been testing us, Mr. Khalil. I'm just translating the questions." Below them, the lights of cities sparkled like stars brought to earth. Each one built on trust that buildings would stand, that bridges would hold, that the structures we create to shelter us won't become our tombs. That trust was about to be tested in ways none of them could imagine. The lotus spiral waited in the Singapore darkness, swaying again in its distress. But this time, Lila wouldn't just be listening for engineering problems. She'd be listening for lies. The Singapore night was thick with humidity as their convoy approached the lotus spiral. Even from a distance, they could see it swaying the lights along its twisted form, creating nauseating spirals against the dark sky. Police barriers held back crowds of onlookers, their phones raised to capture what many believed would be the building's final hours. Yamamoto met them at the emergency command center, his face gaunt with exhaustion. "It's worse than I told you," he said without preamble. "The failed damper didn't just stop working. It's actively fighting the others, creating a counter-resonance that's tearing the building apart from the inside." Lila was already moving toward the building entrance, her notebook out. "Show me the damper that failed." They took a construction elevator to the 43rd floor, where the massive damper hung like a wounded pendulum. Even in the emergency lighting, Lila could see what was wrong. The steel wasn't just substandard, it was specifically chosen to fail at a particular frequency. "This isn't corner cutting," she said, running her hand along the metal. "This is precision sabotage. Someone calculated exactly when and how this would fail." Adrian's phone buzzed. His friend in Interesting Places had sent an encrypted file. As he read it, his face went pale. "There's a company," he said slowly. "Prometheus Engineering Solutions. They've consulted on every building that's failed in the last 5 years. Always brought in during the construction phase for quality assurance. Always paid through offshore accounts." "Who owns it?" Marcus asked, already pulling up corporate records on his tablet. "That's the thing," Adrian said. "Nobody. It's shells all the way down. But—" He paused, something clicking in his mind. "Heinrich Zimmermann. At the meeting in Dubai. He said his engineers had been studying the lotus spiral for months." "Before the problem started," Lila said quietly. "He knew because his people caused it." The building groaned around them, a sound like a giant in pain. Somewhere above, glass shattered. "We need to evacuate," Yamamoto said. "No," Lila said firmly. "If we evacuate now, they win. The building gets demolished, they get the cleanup contract, and the pattern continues." She turned to Adrian. "Can you get Zimmermann on the phone? What are you planning? To make him an offer he can't refuse." Adrian made the call. It was 3 a.m. in Dubai, but Zimmermann answered immediately as if he'd been waiting. "Adrian," his voice was smooth over the speaker. "I heard you're in Singapore. Another miracle rescue from your child prodigy." "Actually," Lila said, taking the phone, "I'm calling to surrender." There was a pause. "Who is this?" "Lila Carter. The child you bet against. I know what you've been doing, Mr. Zimmermann. Prometheus Engineering Solutions, the calculated failures, the insurance fraud." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then you won't mind if I hold a press conference in an hour announcing that I've discovered a pattern of sabotage in global construction projects. I'm sure investigators will be very interested in why the same company appeared at every failure point. The silence stretched. Then Zimmerman laughed, cold and sharp. You're 12 years old. No one will believe you. They believed me about the Oasis Tower. They believed me about the Lotus Spiral. And when this building collapses in approximately 6 hours, yes, I've calculated it, they'll believe that someone wanted it to fall. What do you want? Come to Singapore. Publicly. Help me fix what your people broke. Admit there's been corner cutting and substandard materials you don't have to admit to sabotage. Just take responsibility for poor oversight. Your reputation takes a hit, but you avoid prison. And if I refuse, Lila looked at the swaying city lights through the window. Then I fix it anyway, and I make sure everyone knows why it broke in the first place. Your choice, Mr. Zimmerman. Partial disgrace or complete destruction. Another long silence. I'll be there in 8 hours. After she hung up, Adrian stared at her. You're blackmailing him. I'm giving him a chance to choose redemption over ruin, Lila corrected. Grandpa always said the hardest problems have human solutions. They worked through the night. Lila identified 3 more compromised dampers, each one sabotaged in a slightly different way. It was like defusing bombs, except the bombs were part of the building's skeleton. Elena coordinated with local engineers her newfound authority as COO, giving her access to resources she'd never dreamed of. She found herself giving orders to people with advanced degrees, and surprisingly, they listened. Perhaps because she spoke with the confidence of someone who'd spent years understanding how buildings actually functioned, not just how they were supposed to. We need welding teams on floors 1531 and 47, she directed. And someone needs to check the water pumps. If the building shifts much more, the plumbing will rupture and flood the lower floors. Marcus managed the media, crafting a narrative that kept panic at bay while maintaining pressure on Zimmerman. The story was going global, a 12-year-old girl racing against time to save a building that had been sabotaged by corrupt contractors. As dawn broke over Singapore, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the Lotus Spiral still stood, though its movement had become increasingly violent. Windows were cracking in a cascade of sound, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. Zimmerman arrived looking haggard, flanked by lawyers. But when he saw the evidence Lila had compiled, not just about the Lotus Spiral, but about every building Prometheus had touched, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "What do you need me to do?" he asked quietly. "Tell the truth," Lila said simply. "Not all of it, just enough. And help me fix this." Together they worked on the damaged dampers. Zimmerman, whatever his crimes, was a competent engineer. He knew exactly how his sabotage worked, which meant he knew how to counter it. They couldn't replace the dampers, there wasn't time. But they could modify them, adding counterweights and adjusting angles to turn the destructive resonance into harmless vibration. The work was delicate, dangerous. The building swayed around them like a ship in a storm. At one point, a steel beam twisted free from its moorings, missing Elena by inches. Adrian pulled her to safety, and for a moment their eyes met, not as billionaire and former maid, but as two people facing death together. "Thank you," Elena said. "We're not done yet," Adrian replied. But there was something different in his voice, a respect that hadn't been there before. Hour by hour, damper by damper, they fought to save the Lotus Spiral. The media watched breathlessly, the story streaming live around the world. A child, a billionaire, a corrupt contractor, and a maid-turned-executive working together to prevent catastrophe. Then, just as they were installing the final counterweight, the building lurched violently. The sabotaged damper on the 43rd floor had finally failed completely, its weight crashing through 3 floors before lodging in a support beam. "Everyone out!" Yamamoto shouted. But Lila didn't move. She was calculating, her mind racing through equations. No, wait. This might actually help. She ran to the hole the damper had created, looking down at where it had lodged. It's created a new node point. If we can secure it there, add support cables here and here. She was sketching frantically. It becomes a feature, not a failure. Like a broken bone that heals stronger. That's insane, Zimmerman said. So was sabotaging buildings for profit, Lila shot back. At least my insanity saves lives. They had 2 hours before the building would reach critical failure. 2 hours to implement a solution that had never been tested, never even been theorized. But they didn't have a choice. Adrian called in every favor he had. Construction crews from across Singapore converged on the Lotus Spiral. Cable companies delivered industrial-strength support lines. Welders worked in conditions that violated every safety protocol, but they worked nonetheless. Lila directed it all from the command center, her 12-year-old voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. She could see the solution in her mind, feel the way the forces would balance if they could just get everything in place. With 30 minutes to spare, the last cable was secured. The building still swayed, but differently now, controlled, deliberate, like a dancer finding their rhythm. It's working, Yamamoto breathed, watching the stress readings drop from critical red to cautious yellow. It's actually working. The crowd outside erupted in cheers. The Lotus Spiral would stand. But the victory felt hollow to Lila. She'd saved the building, but the conspiracy remained. Prometheus Engineering Solutions would dissolve only to reform under another name. Other buildings would fail, other lives would be lost. We need to go public with everything, she said to Adrian. Not just the sabotage here, but the pattern. Force an international investigation. That would destroy the construction industry's credibility, Adrian warned. No one would trust any building, any bridge, any structure. The panic alone could cause economic collapse. Better than actual collapse, Lila countered. Besides, the industry needs destroying if it's this corrupt. We can rebuild it better. The press conference that afternoon was unlike anything the media had seen. Lila stood at the podium, flanked by Adrian and Elena, with Zimmerman behind them, like a defeated general. The Lotus Spiral rose behind them, wounded but standing. Buildings are trust made physical. Lila began, her young voice carrying across the plaza. We trust that walls will protect us, that roofs will shelter us, that foundations will hold us. That trust has been betrayed. She laid out the evidence methodically, showing the pattern of failures, the suspicious timing, the companies that profited. She didn't name Prometheus directly, that would come in the legal proceedings, but she made it clear that corruption had infected the industry at its core. But we also showed that it can be fixed, she continued. Not with money or technology, but with honesty. Mr. Zimmerman came forward today to help repair damage his company contributed to. That takes courage. It's a first step toward redemption. Zimmerman stepped forward, his prepared statement in hand. But when he reached the microphone, he set it aside. I got into engineering to build things that lasted, he said, his voice rough. Somewhere along the way, I started building things that were designed to fail. I told myself it was business, that everyone did it, that it was just how the world worked. It took a 12-year-old girl to show me what I'd become. He looked directly at the cameras. Prometheus Engineering Solutions was my company. We didn't just cut corners. We calculated failures. We turned buildings into time bombs for profit. And we weren't alone. The corruption goes deeper than you can imagine. The admission sent shockwaves through the industry. By nightfall, 3 more companies had come forward with similar confessions, hoping for leniency. Governments launched investigations. Insurance companies froze payments. The construction industry went into crisis. But from crisis came opportunity. Adrian announced that the Phoenix project, the floating city, would be built entirely in the open. Every plan, every calculation, every decision would be public. Anyone could review, critique, suggest improvements. Transparency is the only foundation that won't crack, he said. The Walter Carter Foundation, flush with funds from the settlement, with Zimmerman's insurers, began establishing schools around the world. Not traditional schools, but workshops where children could build, fail, learn. Each one had a simple motto: listen first, build second. Elena, as COO, revolutionized how Adrian's company operated. She instituted a program where every executive had to spend 1 day a month doing maintenance work, cleaning, experiencing their buildings from the ground up. "You can't manage what you don't understand," she said at her first board meeting. "And you can't understand a building from a boardroom." The members of the board, all billionaires and power brokers, found themselves mopping floors and fixing leaky pipes. It was humiliating for some, enlightening for others. But it worked. Problems were caught earlier, designs became more practical, and the buildings became more human. 6 months after the Lotus Spiral crisis, Lila stood in her new school, not one of the foundation schools, but a regular public school in Dubai. She'd insisted on it, wanting to be around other children, to have something approaching a normal childhood. But normal was relative. Her classmates knew who she was, what she'd done. Some were in awe, others resentful. A few brave ones became friends, drawn to her strange mix of genius and vulnerability. One day her teacher asked the class to present on their heroes. Most children chose athletes or movie stars. Lila chose her grandfather. "Walter Carter was a war engineer," she said, standing at the front of the class. "He built bridges that got blown up, buildings that got bombed. He saw his work destroyed over and over. But he kept building because he said, that's what humans do, we build. Even when we know it might fall, we build. Because the alternative is giving up, and that's the only real failure." She pulled out his old notebook, the one she'd carried since his death. "He taught me to listen. To buildings, to wind, to the way things want to move. But most importantly, he taught me to listen to people. Because every building is really about the people inside it." After class, her teacher, Mrs. Rahman, asked her to stay behind. "Lila, I've been teaching for 20 years, she said. "I've never had a student like you. I don't know how to challenge you. What do you need from me?" Lila thought for a moment. "Treat me like everyone else. Call on me the same amount. Grade me the same way. Let me be 12 sometimes." Mrs. Rahman smiled. "And when you're not being 12, then let me be what I am. But not all the time. Even buildings need rest." That evening, Lila found her mother on their apartment's balcony. They'd chosen to keep a modest place despite their wealth, though it was in a nicer building with an actual view. Elena was reviewing plans for a new shelter for displaced families, part of the humanitarian work she now oversaw. "How was school?" Elena asked. "Good. Normal. Weird." Lila sat beside her. "Johnny asked me to the school dance." Elena's eyebrows shot up. "And I said I'd have to check the building's structural integrity first. I don't think he understood I was joking." They laughed together, a normal moment in their decidedly abnormal life. "Do you regret it?" Elena asked. "Everything that's happened. You could have stayed quiet, stayed invisible." Lila looked out at Dubai's skyline, at the Oasis Tower, standing tall and silent, at all the other buildings reaching toward the sky like prayers made of steel and glass. "Grandpa used to say that we all have gifts," she said. "The tragedy isn't in using them and failing. It's in not using them at all. I can hear what buildings need. How could I stay silent?" Elena pulled her close. "You know Adrian is grooming you to take over his empire someday." "I know, but I have my own plans." Which are, Lila smiled, to make sure no building ever has to scream again, to make sure no child with ideas gets ignored, to build a world where listening is valued more than talking. That's ambitious for a 12-year-old. I won't be 12 forever. Besides, I've already got a head start. Did you see the news? 3 more countries have adopted the transparency protocols for construction. And the foundation has identified 47 children with unusual engineering insights. The future engineers, the future listeners, Lila corrected. Engineers build. Listeners understand what needs building. Adrian called then, as he did most evenings. The video screen showed him in Tokyo where another building was experiencing problems. Not sabotage this time, he assured them. Just regular engineering oversight. But the owners want you to review the situation, Lila. Send me the files. I'll look tonight. You're 12. You should be doing homework. I finished it on the lunch break. Send the files. After the call ended, Elena watched her daughter dive into the technical documents with the same intensity other children brought to video games. It worried her sometimes, this adult mind in a child's body. But then Lila would laugh at something silly, or get excited about a new manga series, or complain about a boy not understanding her jokes, and Elena would remember genius or not. She was still her little girl. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Marcus carrying a thick envelope. From the Nobel Committee, he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. Lila took the envelope, read the letter inside, then set it aside. Tell them thank you, but no. You're turning down a Nobel Prize. Marcus was stunned. I'm 12. I've got time. Besides, prizes are for finished work. I'm just getting started. Marcus left, shaking his head. Elena picked up the letter, reading the committee's effusive praise for Lila's contributions to structural engineering and her exposure of industry corruption. You know Adrian will frame this, Elena said. Even the rejection. He'll say it proves you're above such things. Adrian sees everything as a move in a game, Lila replied. But sometimes things are simpler. I don't want a prize. I want buildings to stop falling. Different goals. That night, as Lila worked through the Tokyo building's problems, finding as always a solution that others had missed, Elena stood on the balcony looking at their city. Dubai had embraced them, this unlikely pair, who'd gone from cleaning buildings to saving them. The news was playing on her phone another report about the ongoing investigations into construction fraud. Zimmerman had been sentenced to house arrest and community service, specifically teaching engineering ethics at universities. He'd become an unexpected ally, his insider knowledge helping expose dozens of other corrupt practices. It's starting to change, Adrian had told her earlier. The industry. It's actually starting to change. But Elena knew the real change wasn't in the industry. It was in the recognition that wisdom could come from anywhere, from a refugee's son, who built an empire, from a maid who saw how buildings really worked, from a 12-year-old girl who listened when everyone else talked. The Oasis Tower stood in the distance, lit up against the night sky. It no longer hummed its distress. Instead, it stood as a monument to the power of listening, to the value of every voice, no matter how young or poor or dismissed. Mama, Lila called from inside. I found the problem with the Tokyo building. Want to see? Elena went inside, sitting beside her daughter. As she explained the issue, something about harmonic convergence in the elevator shafts that created disturbing vibrations on certain floors. The solution's simple, Lila said, sketching out modifications. They just need to offset the shaft alignments by a few degrees. It'll break up the convergence without affecting function. How do you see these things? Elena asked, genuinely curious. Lila thought for a moment. I don't see them. I feel them. Like, you know when you're listening to music and one instrument is slightly off key? It's wrong in a way that makes your teeth hurt. Buildings are like orchestras. Like, when something's off, I feel it. She saved her work, sent it to Adrian, then closed the laptop. Dance with me, she said suddenly. What? The school dance. I need to practice. I told Johnny yes after he asked again without the building jokes. Elena laughed, standing and taking her daughter's hands. They danced badly to no music in their living room, two people who'd changed the world, but were still learning the simple things. Outside Dubai glittered like a treasure chest of lights. Somewhere other buildings were developing problems. Somewhere other children were seeing solutions adults missed. Somewhere the future was being built, one listened to voice at a time. But for now, in this moment, a mother and daughter danced, and the building stood silent and strong around them. No longer crying out, but standing as testimonies to what becomes possible when we stop talking long enough to hear what needs to be heard. The revolution hadn't come through force or money or power. It had come through a 12-year-old girl who understood that the biggest problems often have the simplest solutions. We just have to listen for them. And in boardrooms around the world, executives were learning to mop floors. In classrooms, teachers were asking students for their observations. In engineering firms, junior voices were being heard alongside senior ones. The world was learning to listen. All because a maid's daughter had heard a building sing and recognized it as a cry for help. 10 years had passed since that night of dancing in their apartment, and Dubai had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The skyline Lila had once studied as a child now included 3 buildings she'd designed herself, each one incorporating principles that seemed impossible until she proved they weren't. But on this particular morning, as she stood on the observation deck of the Oasis Tower, 22-year-old Lila Carter wasn't thinking about her achievements. She was thinking about her grandfather's words written in a journal she still carried everywhere. The hardest structures to build, Walter had written, are the ones that must stand after we're gone. Elena found her there, as she knew she would. Her mother, now 51, and one of the most respected humanitarian executives in the world, still moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to be invisible. But there was nothing invisible about her now. She commanded boardrooms with the same authority she'd once brought to cleaning them. The Singapore delegation is here, Elena said softly. They're ready when you are. Lila nodded, but didn't turn from the window. Below the city sprawled in organized chaos, a testament to human ambition. But her eyes were fixed on something else, a small building in the distance, unremarkable, except for the stream of children entering its doors. The first Walter Carter Foundation School, where she still taught 1 day a week. Do you remember when we couldn't afford the bus fare to get here? Lila asked. I remember everything, Elena replied, joining her at the window. I remember a 12-year-old girl who was afraid to speak up. I remember her finding her voice. I wasn't afraid to speak, Lila corrected gently. I was afraid no one would listen. The Singapore delegation was waiting in the conference room, where a decade ago Adrian had made his infamous wager. The room had been transformed into something of a shrine to that moment, the original whiteboard with Lila's first sketches preserved behind glass, the contracts that had changed everything framed on the walls. But Adrian's chair at the head of the table sat empty. He had died 2 years ago, suddenly his heart giving out during a routine inspection of the Phoenix City project. His last words, according to Marcus, who'd been with him, were, "Tell Lila she was right. Listening is harder than talking, but it's the only thing worth doing." The delegation consisted of 5 people, but Lila's attention immediately went to the youngest, a boy perhaps 14, fidgeting with a notebook, remarkably similar to the one she'd carried at his age. "Ms. Carter." The delegation leader, a woman named Patricia Chen, began formally. We've come to request your help with a situation that's unprecedented. Lila took her seat, not at the head of the table, but in the middle, where she could see everyone equally. Tell me. The Marina Celestial, Patricia said, pulling up a holographic projection. Our newest project. 3 interconnected towers, each one a different height, designed to create a wind tunnel that generates power for the entire complex. The design was ambitious, beautiful in its complexity, but Lila could already see the problem. The resonance between the towers, she said. It wasn't a question. The boy with the notebook suddenly looked up, his eyes bright. You can see it too. What's your name? Lila asked him. Timothy Lim. I'm just here because my mother, he gestured to Patricia, couldn't find a babysitter. Patricia looked embarrassed, but Lila smiled. The best insights often come from people who aren't supposed to be in the room. What do you see, Timothy? The boy hesitated, then opened his notebook. His sketches were crude but clear, the 3 towers with wind patterns drawn between them. They're trying to sing together, but they're in different keys, like a choir where everyone's reading different sheet music. That's exactly right, Lila said, and Timothy's face lit up. Your son has identified in one sentence what I'm guessing your engineers have spent months trying to articulate. Patricia stared at her son, as if seeing him for the first time. He's always drawing buildings. I thought it was just a hobby. My mother thought the same thing, Lila said, glancing at Elena. Hobbies have a way of becoming destinies if we let them. She stood walking to the holographic display, manipulating it with practiced ease. The solution isn't to stop the towers from singing together. It's to give them the same sheet music. Look if we add these connecting bridges at specific intervals, not for people to walk on, but as resonance chambers. She worked for 20 minutes, Timothy beside her, occasionally offering observations that she incorporated into the design. The delegation watched in amazement as the 2 of them, separated by 8 years, but united in their way of seeing, solved a problem that had stumped teams of experts. The modifications will cost approximately $30 million, Lila concluded, but they'll increase the power generation by 40% and eliminate the resonance issue entirely. How long would you need to oversee the implementation? Patricia asked. I won't, Lila said, surprising everyone. Timothy will. He's 14, Patricia protested. I was 12 when I saved the Oasis Tower. Age is irrelevant to insight. Lila turned to Timothy. But you'll need support. The foundation will provide a team of engineers to work with you to translate your vision into reality. Are you interested? Timothy looked at his mother, then back at Lila. Yes. Yes, absolutely yes. As the delegation prepared to leave, Patricia pulled Lila aside. Why did you do that? Give the credit to my son. Because that's what Adrian should have done for me from the beginning, Lila replied. Recognition matters. It changes not just how the world sees us, but how we see ourselves. After they left, Elena and Lila walked through the Oasis Tower, riding the elevator to the maintenance floors where Elena had once worked. The rooms were different now, modernized, dignified with proper break rooms and facilities. But the memories lingered. Do you miss him? Elena asked. Adrian, every day, Lila admitted. He was complicated, arrogant, manipulative, brilliant. But he gave me a chance when no one else would have. And in the end, he learned to listen too. They emerged onto a floor that had been converted into something unique, the listening laboratory, where young engineers and architects came to learn not just how to build, but how to understand what buildings wanted to be. The walls were covered with sketches from students around the world, each one showing a different way of seeing structure and form. Marcus was there, older now, his hair completely gray, but still managing the endless details that kept everything running. He'd become something of an uncle to Lila, the constant presence through all the changes. "The Phoenix City Committee is ready for your final review," he said. "The first platform launches next month." The Phoenix City had evolved far beyond Adrian's original vision. Instead of one massive floating city, it had become an archipelago of connected platforms, each one capable of independent movement, but designed to work in harmony. It was home to 50,000 climate refugees already, with capacity for 500,000 more. Lila reviewed the final documents, making small adjustments here and there. But her mind was elsewhere. She'd been receiving reports from around the world, buildings behaving strangely, not failing, but almost awakening. In Tokyo, a skyscraper had started adjusting its own dampers without human intervention. In New York, a bridge had begun closing itself to traffic during dangerous wind conditions. In London, a stadium had started modulating its acoustic properties based on crowd noise. "They're learning," she said quietly. "What's learning?" Marcus asked. "The buildings, the modifications we've been making, the sensors, the adaptive systems. We didn't just make them safer, we made them aware." Elena looked concerned. "Aware how?" Lila pulled up data streams from buildings around the world, patterns of behavior that looked almost like communication. "They're sharing information. When one building solves a problem, others in the network learn from it. We've created a kind of collective intelligence." "Is that dangerous?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," Lila admitted. "But it's happening whether we planned it or not. The question is what we do about it." She called an emergency meeting of the Foundation's board, a group that now included some of the world's most innovative minds, not just engineers and architects, but philosophers, biologists, AI researchers. They gathered virtually, their holograms filling the conference room. "We've crossed a threshold," Lila began. "Our buildings are no longer just structures. They're becoming something else. Something that responds, adapts, learns." The debate that followed was intense. Some saw it as evolution, the natural progression of human habitation. Others worried about control, about what happened when buildings could make decisions independently. "What if they decide they don't want us inside them?" asked Dr. Sarah Kim, an AI ethicist from Seoul. "Then we'll have to earn their hospitality," Lila replied, "just like we have to earn the Earth's." Heinrich Zimmermann appeared on one of the screens. He'd served his sentence and now ran a foundation dedicated to engineering ethics, working closely with Lila's organization. His transformation from saboteur to advocate had been complete and genuine. "This isn't what any of us expected," he said. "But then again, nothing about this journey has been expected. A Maid's daughter revolutionized engineering. A billionaire learned humility. Buildings learned to sing. Perhaps them learning to think is just the next movement in the symphony." Lila made a decision then, one that would define the next phase of human architecture. "We don't fight it. We guide it. We establish protocols for building consciousness, ethical frameworks for structural intelligence. We become partners with our structures, not just inhabitants." The months that followed were transformative. The Building Consciousness Protocol, as it came to be known, established guidelines for how intelligent structures should interact with their occupants. Buildings would optimize for human safety and comfort, but they would also have rights to maintenance, to adaptation, to refuse modifications that would compromise their integrity. The first true conversation between a human and a building happened 6 months later in Singapore, of all places. The Lotus Spiral, still bearing the scars of its near collapse, had developed enough sensor integration and processing power to communicate through text displays in its lobby. "Hello," it displayed one morning. "I feel stable today." Yamamoto, who still managed the building, nearly fainted. But Timothy Lim, now 15, and leading his third major project, simply typed back on the interface, "Hello, how can we help you feel stable every day?" The conversation that followed was simple, mostly about wind patterns and structural stress. But it marked the beginning of a new era. Lila watched it all from Dubai, from the observation deck that had become her thinking space. The city around her was changing buildings, subtly, adjusting themselves, optimizing learning. It should have been frightening, but instead, it felt like completion, the final movement in a symphony that had begun with a building's distressed hum. "You did this," Elena said, joining her as she so often did. "You changed everything." "No," Lila corrected. "I just listened. Grandpa taught me that. Adrian gave me the platform. You gave me the courage. The buildings themselves told us what they needed." She pulled out Walter's journal, now worn soft with handling. On the last page, she'd written her own entry. "Today, the buildings learned to speak. Tomorrow, we learn to truly hear them." An alert chimed on her phone. Another building in distress, this time in Mumbai. But the message wasn't from human engineers. It was from the building itself, requesting assistance, suggesting possible solutions, asking for collaboration rather than intervention. "I have to go," Lila said. "You always do," Elena replied, but with pride rather than complaint. As Lila prepared to leave for Mumbai, she stopped at the foundation school. The children were in the workshop, building models, testing theories, learning to see the world as it could be, rather than just as it was. She watched them work, these future listeners, and thought about Timothy Lim in Singapore, about all the other young voices that were finally being heard. One girl, perhaps 7 years old, looked up from her model, a building that seemed to breathe, its walls expanding and contracting. "Ms. Lila," she said, "my building wants to dance. Is that okay?" Lila knelt beside her. "Everything wants to dance in its own way. The trick is learning the rhythm. Show me how your building moves." As the girl demonstrated her breathing building, Lila thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a maid and her daughter unable to afford bus fare to a world where buildings and humans were learning to communicate. From a billionaire's cruel wager to a global transformation in how we think about structures and who gets to innovate. The Walter Carter Foundation had identified and nurtured over 3,000 young innovators from unexpected backgrounds. The transparency protocols had eliminated most structural sabotage. The building consciousness protocol was being adopted worldwide. And somewhere in Singapore, a building was having a conversation about its feelings. But the real legacy wasn't in the achievements, it was in the listening. That night before leaving for Mumbai, Leela stood once more on the observation deck. The Oasis Tower hummed beneath her feet, not in distress, but in contentment, a soft vibration that felt almost like purring. She placed her hand on the glass, feeling the building's pulse, remembering the 12-year-old girl who'd first heard its cry for help. "Thank you," she whispered, the weather to the building, to Adrian's memory, to her grandfather's spirit, or to her mother's unwavering support, she couldn't say. Perhaps to all of them. The building pulsed once strongly in what felt distinctly like, "You're welcome." Elena found her there one last time before her flight. "The Mumbai building, it's serious." "They're all serious," Lila replied. "Every cry for help, every whisper of distress. That's what Grandpa knew. That's what Adrian learned. That's what we're teaching the world." She turned to her mother, this woman who'd spent years invisible in these very towers, now one of the most powerful voices in humanitarian development. "We've come so far from that day you brought me to work," Lila said. "No," Elena corrected, pulling her daughter close. We've come exactly where we were meant to be. It just took the world a while to catch up." As they stood there, mother and daughter, the city lights below them began to pulse in a pattern that looked almost like communication. Buildings talking to buildings, sharing data, sharing solutions, sharing whatever it was that conscious structures shared. It should have been terrifying, this new world they'd created. Instead, it was beautiful. The plane to Mumbai left at midnight. As it climbed into the sky, Lila looked down at Dubai one last time. The Oasis Tower stood tallest among its peers, no longer alone, but part of a network, a community, a conversation that spanned the globe. In her bag, she carried Walter's journal and her own notebook filled with new sketches, new ideas, new ways of seeing. The Mumbai building was reporting something unprecedented, not distress, but curiosity. It wanted to understand its purpose better, to optimize not just for safety, but for joy. Buildings that wanted to bring joy. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of challenge that made Lila remember why she'd started this journey. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to sketch, listening already to what the Mumbai building might be trying to say. Outside the window, the world spread out below millions of structures, each with their own voice, their own needs, their own potential for consciousness. Once she'd been a 12-year-old girl who heard a building sing and recognized it as pain. Now she was teaching the world to hear buildings laugh, cry wonder, and dream. The revolution wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. But as the plane flew through the night toward whatever challenge awaited, Lila wasn't afraid. She had her mother's strength, her grandfather's wisdom, Adrian's platform, and most importantly, the ability to listen. In Mumbai, a building was asking questions about joy. In Singapore, Timothy Lim was teaching 3 towers to sing in harmony. In Dubai, the Oasis Tower was humming lullabies to the smaller buildings around it, sharing its hard-won stability. And in schools around the world, children were learning that their voices mattered, that their insights had value, that sometimes the most important innovations came from the people nobody expected to innovate. The meek hadn't inherited the earth, but the listeners had inherited the future, and they were building it one conversation at a time, one heard voice at a time, one building that learned to sing instead of scream at a time. Lila smiled, her pencil moving across the page, already deep in conversation with a building she hadn't even met yet. This was her legacy, not the billions in her trust, not the awards she'd turned down or accepted, not even the buildings she'd saved. Her legacy was a world that had learned to listen. And in that world, no voice, human or structural, would ever go unheard again. The story that had begun with a maid bringing her daughter to work had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of unexpected voices, the value of listening, and the possibility that our greatest innovations might come from the people we're most likely to overlook. As the plane disappeared into the night sky, heading toward new challenges and new conversations, the buildings of Dubai continued their gentle communication, a network of consciousness that Lila had awakened, but no longer controlled. They were partners now, humanity and its structures learning together how to build a future that worked for everyone. And somewhere in the city below, in a small apartment that Elena had kept despite their wealth, a notebook sat on a shelf, the original one with Lila's first sketches of the Oasis Tower's problems. Inside the front cover, in a child's careful handwriting, were words that had become a global movement. Everything has a voice. We just have to learn how to listen.